We'll leave one more minute to let others join, and we'll start shortly. Thank you again for participating. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you again and welcome to Lead Defense. So I'm gonna briefly introduce Lydia, and then how it's gonna function. She's gonna be presenting for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have it open for questions from the audience. We'll have a few minutes, and then we'll move on to the closed session with the committee. So first and foremost, I wanted to share that Lydia is a Mainer. She was born and raised in Maine, and she grew up in the woods of Holden. She pursued a bachelor's in science in conservation biology with minors in anthropology and French from St. Lawrence University in New York. After getting her degree, she went on and worked as a field technician at UMaine with Dr. Ellie Groden, research with ants, and later went to Oklahoma State University, also working as a field technician. I was very fortunate to have met Lydia in 2015 when we welcomed her to our team to do research on climate change here in the state of Maine. And since the first semester, she showed great talent and great skills at teaching. So we knew John Daigle and I were fortunate to have her as a TA for several of our classes. And we knew that she was a natural teacher. So have a lot of expectations what she'll be doing in the future as a professor. And so I feel very lucky to have been working with Lydia over the last 5 years, first as she was pursuing her master's degree on trying to understand climate change adaptation in Western Maine. And now as a PhD candidate working still on climate change in tourism, but mostly on coastal Maine. Lydia loves international travel and learning about new cultures. And those are certainly several of the passions that we both share. For many of you who are professors, you know that one of the highlights of being a faculty member is seeing our graduate students defend their work. And I would say that this is a very special occasion, not only as I'm seeing one of my graduate students defend, but because Lydia is my first PhD student, and also because she will be our first NRT trainee to defend her work. So this is even a more special day because of the different things that are coming together on this day. So there's so much that I could share about Lydia and how wonderful it has been to work with her and learn with her over these past 5 years. But she has a lot to share with us. So without further ado, I will let Lydia lead us through her presentation about her work. So thank you, Lydia, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandra, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining this afternoon. As Sandra mentioned, I'm going to be sharing some findings from the last 3 years with my PhD work, which is focused on fostering community resilience in coastal nature-based tourism destinations in Maine by understanding climate change risks and behavioral responses. I'm going to begin this presentation with an overview of the whole study, So we're going to talk about topics related to climate change and tourism, tourism destinations, community resilience, and tourism in Maine, before moving on to talk about two components of the dissertation. So the first component I'll share was looking at community resilience to climate change in the Bay of Machias. The second component I'll highlight was a case study of destination resilience on Mount Desert Island by studying climate change risk perceptions and behavioral adaptations. And then I'll wrap it up with some overall conclusions. So tourism is a globally important economic activity that's also reliant on the environment and climate. And this reliance on the environment and climate makes it at risk to climate change impacts. We know that nature-based tourism destinations, coastal and mountain destinations are all especially at risk to climate change impacts. And because we're focusing on coastal destinations, some of the effects we're going to be seeing include sea level rise, coastal flooding, extreme weather events, erosion, and saltwater intrusion. A recent study of the tourism industry suggests that it's more vulnerable than resilient to climate change. However, we know that both visitors and tourism suppliers can both mitigate climate change or adapt to climate change. And adaptations here refer to adjustments or actions in reaction to actual or perceived effects to alleviate harm or take advantage of potentially emerging opportunities, while mitigation refers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Previous research has indicated that climate change will impact the tourism industry by impacting visitor demand, seasonality, and destination appeal. We also have examples of how tourism supplier actions can help counter those negative shifts in visitation and potentially avoid any undesirable changes to visitation patterns. And by tourism suppliers, I mean people like business owners, the National Park Service, or nonprofits whose mission aligns to support tourism and outdoor recreation in some way. So I've talked about a tourism destination a couple of times, so it's probably important that we define it. There is some debate in the field about how best to define a destination, but I prefer a definition put forth by Gunn and Var, which describes destinations as access points, gateways, attractions, one or more host communities, and the linkages between those host communities and the attractions. So when we think about tourism destinations, oftentimes we automatically think about the attractions, so a national park or an amusement park, for example. But it's important to consider the range of services these host communities provide, such as access points, so transportation hubs such as airports or bus stations, as well as a range of support services like restaurants, hotels, gas stations, and Wi-Fi. So there's this inherent link between host communities and the visitors coming to that destination. Rural destinations are often located in low population density areas, so they might be comprised of a series of host communities that provide those attractions and services. And because of this definition, I think that there's overlap between the notion of a tourism destination and a community. So we're therefore applying concepts related to community resilience to better understand tourism destination resilience, specifically to climate change. So resilience was first described by Holling in 1973. He defined the word as the persistence of systems and their ability to absorb change or disturbance while still maintaining their function. And he was referring specifically to ecological systems. More recently, this concept of resilience has been applied to social systems, but there are several key differences between ecological and social systems, which can include elements of foresight, communication, technology, adaptive capacity, and learning. So you can see from this definition of community resilience, it's very similar to Holling's definition of ecological resilience. So community resilience can be described as the ability to maintain, renew, or reorganize its function in a system characterized by change and uncertainty. For this work, I use a slightly more recent definition by Magis, who describes community resilience as the existence, development, and engagement of community resources by community members to thrive in an environment characterized by change and uncertainty. So essentially both having these community assets and being able to use them in ways that empower decision-making within the community. There are 3 components of this dissertation across 2 nature-based tourism destinations. I apply concepts from resilience as well as the risk perceptions literature to better understand tourism resilience to climate change. And I do this in Mount Desert Island as well as the Bay of Machias for my 2 study sites using a range of methods, including interviews, pile sorts, a visitor survey, and archival evidence. The overarching goal of this dissertation and this project was sort of twofold: to better understand how nature-based tourism stakeholders, both suppliers and visitors, perceive their risk to climate change and how that impacts their behavioral responses, as well as to gain a better understanding of how destination resilience to climate change could be enhanced across Maine's coastal nature-based tourism communities. And it's important to note that while we're studying climate change in this study, perhaps lessons learned from this dissertation could be applied to other shocks and stressors, such as things like an economic recession or the pandemic that we're all in. Tourism is an important industry for the state of Maine. You can see from these numbers that tourism supported a lot of economic development and supported 17% of state employment. 37.4 million visitors came to the state last year, which, to put it in perspective, the population of Maine is about 1.3 million residents. So there's a huge influx of visitors coming into the state. And some of the primary motivations for visiting in Maine are related to our natural resource base. So motivations like scenery, ocean views, the beaches, the coastline, mountains, nature, and wildlife are all features that are attracting visitors to Maine. And because of this reliance on natural features to support tourism, we are expecting that climate change will impact this industry. So some of the changes that we're already seeing and that we expect to continue to see, or trends that we expect to continue to see, include an increase in average annual temperatures. So it's getting warmer. We're seeing an increase in precipitation overall, but in the form of rain, and a decrease in snowfall. The summer season is getting a little bit longer and our winters are getting shorter. The Gulf of Maine is one of the most rapidly warming parts of the ocean, so we would expect to see things like species shift and changing fisheries as a result of that. We're also expecting to see more frequent, unpredictable extreme weather events, as well as a slew of other impacts like sea level rise, loss of salt marshes, flooding, beach erosion, and increased presence of ticks. And you might look at this list and say, oh, these are overall like rather negative, but it's important to note that climate change will present both challenges and opportunities for Maine's tourism industry. So for example, the extension of the summer season might mean that, especially along the coast, areas will receive increased visitation. And in fact, that's what we're already seeing. So that introduction brings us to the first component I'm going to share about this research, which was understanding community resilience to climate change in the Bay of Machias, which is a rural nature-based tourism destination. So we know that resilient host communities develop both individual and collective capacity to respond to and influence change. And these capacities are often described as assets, resources, or capitals. And we may inherently think of something like money as a financial asset for a community, but if you look over on the right-hand side of the screen at this resilience framework, you'll see that there's a variety of social, community, political assets, as well as built-in financial resources. So this framework comes from a 2013 study by Berkes and Ross, which they undertook a review of the ecological and psychological resilience literature to see where there were areas of overlap across systems, and then they created this framework, which essentially says that things like social networks, people-place relationships, and community infrastructure, if present in a community in some combination, can help lead to self-organization and agency to further enhance community resilience. And I'll note here that overall resilience theory and resilience thinking has been little applied to tourism research. So we're hoping to address or add to that emerging body of literature by applying the Berkey's and Ross community resilience framework to study a tourism destination. There were 3 goals for this component of my dissertation. The first was to gain an in-depth understanding of tourism industry suppliers' perceptions and experiences in the Bay of Machias related to climate change, as well as understanding what kinds of adaptation strategies might be employed to respond. What I want to highlight here for the purpose of this presentation is the 3rd goal, which was to determine what community assets enabled deploying resilience enhancing strategies in this nature-based tourism destination. So the Bay of Machias is located in Down East Maine. It's a relatively rural area with about 5,500 predominantly year-round residents. There's a reliance on the natural resource base to support the economy, including, of course, nature-based tourism, but also blueberry harvesting and fishing. The average household income is below the state average. So the area is sometimes characterized as dealing with issues of poverty, high unemployment, food insecurity, and opioid crisis, and being affected by the opioid crisis. And I'll note also that the downtown Machias is especially low-lying and at high risk to flooding, which is important because it's a gateway into the community. So not only does Route 1 connect the Bay of Machias to important Canadian and New England tourism markets, but there's many support services located in the town of Machias in this low-lying area. So you might look at these numbers and say, okay, this is a rural resource poor community that maybe is not able to adapt or consider this global phenomenon of climate change. And actually what we found was rather the opposite. And we were able to get at this understanding by adopting a phenomenological methodology. And the purpose of phenomenology is to gain an in-depth understanding of participants' lived experiences and their subjective understandings of their own experiences. So what does it mean to be a nature-based tourism stakeholder in the Bay of Machias experiencing climate change? And again, I'll just reiterate that by tourism suppliers, we're referring to business owners, nonprofits whose mission aligns to support tourism in some way, local leaders and municipal officials, as well as researchers, again, whose research overlaps with this study. Common to phenomenology, we use semi-structured interviews for the methods. Those started out face-to-face, and I didn't finish before COVID-19 hit, so I did follow up with a few phone interviews towards the end of the study. I was able to present the project at a regional tourism symposium in the fall of 2017, which helped the project gain traction and resulted in the first few initial interview participants. I then used chain referral, whereby participants recommended other potential participants until saturation was achieved, or the point at which no new data emerged. And that ended up being 17 interviews. I'll point out that the table on the right contains pseudonyms, and all other slides that have quotes also contain pseudonyms, so there's no actual participant names here. And then these interviews were transcribed verbatim, which means that we included all of the ums and pauses and repeat words to stay as close as possible to participant meanings. And you'll see that reflected in the quotes. I used interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA, to analyze these interview data. And that starts by reading through the transcripts before doing any coding to gain an understanding of the whole. I then bracketed any of my preconceived notions and took what was given by participants precisely as it was given. And then begins this iterative coding cycle. So first cycle coding was predominantly in vivo codes, which are codes that are in participants' own words. And then second cycle coding begins to condense those codes into descriptive or pattern codes before arriving at themes. And I will emphasize that this is an iterative process that involves multiple rounds of coding, as well as using tools in vivo to perform queries and to visualize the data, as well as a lot of reflection and memoing to further enhance analysis. And we did use the Berkey's and Ross Community Resilience Framework to organize and interpret codes. So that's sort of what you'll see reflected on the next slide. So I don't have time to go touch upon every element of the community resilience framework, but I want to highlight areas where Machias had really strong social networks, where the Bay of Machias had sort of mixed people-place relationships, and an area of weakness, which was community infrastructure. Social networks refer to networks of collaboration and cooperation, and partnerships were very important for participants in the Bay of Machias, partnerships between individuals and across organizations. And this really facilitated a lot of knowledge sharing between organizations and individuals, as well as an avenue to leverage skills and resources so that people and groups could accomplish larger and more complex tasks than if they had been working individually. And this led to a small, highly collaborative leadership team that applied for what I call the exploratory seawall grant. So coastal flooding was a prime concern for the Bay of Machias, and this group of leaders decided to apply for a grant that would bring in an engineer to explore seawall design concepts. Previous research has found that social networks are essential for community resilience, as is this idea of matching the task to available resources and capacities. So for example, the small leadership team didn't have the technical capacity to engineer the seawall, but they did have the local knowledge of local flooding and skills related to grant writing and collaboration to be able to bring in someone for that technical expertise. People-place relationships can be described as the emotional bonds that influence attitudes and behaviors within a specific setting. Overall, participants described a really strong sense of place and community throughout the study area, especially in relation to natural resource livelihoods. So it was described, there was a shared environmental ethos that was felt to be prominent across the community because of the connection to economic livelihoods. There were, however, some issues with retaining youth in the study area. So that was described as high school graduates and graduates from the university having to leave the area to pursue economic options. Though hopefully some participants expressed hope that that was a reversing trend. Not surprisingly, people-place relationships have been important in enhancing community resilience in past studies, and specifically in the context of climate change can help motivate community adaptations. However, we also can find instances where strong people-place relationships hinder community resilience, where people become attached to how things are and are unable to respond to changing conditions. And how this can look in the data will be exemplified in this illustrative quote from Mary, who was a participant working at a nonprofit. And she was describing how the Bay of Machias is often categorized or characterized as being resource poor. But she goes on to say that there's a richness in people and values that seems to be lacking in other places. They're not going to be the richest financially, but they can be the richest when it comes to human values. And that was really important for her. And then the last element of the framework I'll highlight was community infrastructure in need of development. So overall, this was the #1 concern related to climate change impacts. Infrastructure was described as old and crumbling, as well as having a lack of housing stock, which is a problem for residents, especially those looking to retire in the area, and a lack of bed base, so not having many overnight accommodations available for tourists. And then, not specific to the Bay of Machias, but rather a problem in many rural areas in Maine, there was limited internet access. And these community infrastructure challenges were largely viewed as out of the control of this group of participants. One of the interesting findings from the literature is that community infrastructure projects are relatively common for rural areas, as they tend to be underbuilt or lacking in infrastructure. But these projects have the ability to spiral up, where yes, your goal for the project is to improve built infrastructure, but there are also these other great side effects like improving social assets. So thinking again about this seawall grant, yes, the focus is developing this built infrastructure, but we're also seeing strengthening of partnerships and knowledge and skill set sharing across those groups, as well as leadership capacity. And the quote I'm going to share from Diane, who was a municipal official interviewed for the area, she is describing how, yes, participants are aware that it would be great to have more flood resilient infrastructure, but that's not necessarily something they see happening very quickly. So Diane describes how most bridges in Maine are at least 100 years old. So the chances of getting any current infrastructure changed are probably little to none, because the Maine Department of Transportation can't afford to replace the ones they need to replace, never mind one that's technically functioning correctly. So infrastructure is probably 50 or 60 years out from seeing any change from the state level. So what can we learn from this study in the Bay of Machias that might be applicable to other similarly rural developing tourism destinations who are also facing climate change? Well, we found that even though some may characterize the Bay of Machias as resource poor, there's actually, to borrow a word from Mary, a richness in the social, community, and political assets for the area, including long-term partnerships, the ability to leverage skills and local knowledge, engaging locals with a decision-making process, and drawing on strong people-place relationships where they exist, as well as adopting a positive outlook, so the ability to affect change. And overall, I would say that it's important to consider community strengths and available assets while also matching those strengths and assets to the most pressing concerns when deciding what climate change actions to take to help improve resilience. Some limitations of the study include that it is context specific. However, we might expect to see similar results in destinations that share similar characteristics. As I mentioned before, COVID-19 had hit before I was able to finish interviews, so that certainly had an influence on the final few participants' perceptions, as well as switching the interview modality to phone. And then something we're going to be talking about more in the next component is the importance of having visitor data and understanding potential shifts in visitation as a result of climate change. And the way the state tourism regions are drawn up, the Bay of Machias is in the Down East and Acadia tourism region, which also includes Mount Desert Island. So visitor data very much so reflect the reality on Mount Desert Island rather than the rest of Down East Maine. I would suggest that future research look at different ways to apply resilience thinking and concepts within the realm of tourism and outdoor recreation. And I'm especially interested in looking at whether or not this idea of community resilience and the Berkey's and Ross framework is applicable to larger, more developed destinations, or if really that only works for smaller, more developing rural areas. So that brings us to the second component that I want to highlight, which was also looking at destination resilience to climate change, but by studying risk perceptions and behavioral adaptations of both tourism suppliers and visitors to the area. Risk perceptions are subjective assessments of the probability of an accident happening and how concerned we are with the impacts. So in the case of climate change, they're risk perceptions specifically evaluate climate change as a threat. And we know from previous research that risk perceptions can be determined by a range of factors, including things like cognition, experience with climate impacts, sociocultural influences like norms and values, and sociodemographics. We also know from previous research that climate change risk perceptions can influence stakeholder adaptations. And in the context of this study, by stakeholders, we refer to both visitors and suppliers, so both supply and demand. We know that climate change can alter the desirability of destinations as well as change access to certain areas. Specifically, climate change risk perceptions can influence travel decisions and coping behaviors, such as destination selection, the timing of your visit, or the timing of your trip to an area, and the activities in which a traveler participates while they're on vacation. And this is just to say that we're expecting global changes to visitor flows as a result of climate change. Previous studies have indicated that risk perceptions have the ability to influence supplier decisions to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And as I mentioned before, some of these supplier actions can help reduce negative visitor perceptions and potentially avoid negative shifts in visitation. And really, this is all talking about the importance of aligning supply and demand within a destination to increase resilience. So we know that visitors will alter their travel behavior in response to climate change. We also know it's important for tourism suppliers to anticipate those responses and respond to changes in visitor demand. Because ultimately, a misalignment between the products and services tourism suppliers create in supply and visitor demand will result in destination decline. So the goal of this component was to gain a better understanding of destination resilience by studying stakeholder risk perceptions, behavioral responses, and the context of this case. So our research questions center on understanding risk perceptions for both supply and demand, as well as behavioral responses, and both intended and in place. And then we're also interested in looking at where gaps exist between supply and demand, both in terms of their risk perceptions and their behavioral responses. So our study site for this component was Mount Desert Island, home to Acadia National Park. You can see from the numbers, there's a lot of people coming to this destination, and it creates a lot of economic impact for the county. Previous studies have found that visitation and visitor spending to Acadia National Park is expected to increase as temperatures warm under climate change. So we can see from the numbers that it's a very developed tourism destination. And we also know from some of the archival evidence and interviews that tourism stakeholders and residents have mixed feelings about this increase in visitation, as exemplified by some towns refusing to allow cruise ships to dock and others allowing them to dock. I adopted a case study methodology, which was especially important in this study because I used multiple methods, including a quantitative visitor survey and qualitative interviews to understand both supply and demand. And then a review of the archival evidence allowed me to understand the context of this case. And really the beauty, one of the strengths of the case study is allowing for these multiple methods, which can be braided together to gain a better understanding or more in-depth holistic understanding of the case. I'm not gonna talk too much about data collection methods and analysis, especially because the interview process mirrors the Bay of Machias process. I did conduct 24 semi-structured interviews with tourism suppliers. So again, that's business owners, nonprofits whose mission supports tourism, the National Park Service, etc. And these interviews were transcribed and coded in the same way that the Bay of Machias interviews were. I also collected archival evidence, which in this case was predominantly newspaper articles, scientific reports, and previous survey work in the area. And those findings, again, were coded similarly to the interviews. I will spend a little bit more time on the visitor survey. So we used an on-site intercept survey using a two-stage cluster probability sampling strategy, which is a long way of saying that we chose random dates and random locations within Acadia National Park to survey visitors at places like visitor centers, popular attractions, or trailheads. So we were on site in these locations, both myself and a team of really awesome research assistants. And we used something called an interval sampling strategy, whereby we picked a number between 1 and 10, depending on the density of visitors that day. Let's say it was a high density visitor day and our number was 8. So we would approach every 8th visitor group to participate in the front end survey. So we asked them a few questions on an iPad and then handed them a postcard with a link to a longer online follow-up survey. We also asked for their contact information so that we could send up to 2 reminders to further enhance our response rate. And for this component, I'm solely reporting on descriptive statistics from that survey. So in the summer of 2018, we intercepted about 1,300 visitors and got 480 usable responses. So our response rate was about 36%. So for results, I'm first going to focus on sharing threat perceptions to tourism on MDI as related to climate change for both stakeholder groups, and then we'll talk a little bit about the adaptation strategies both groups were intending to employ or already employing. On that visitor survey, we asked participants to rate several climate change factors based on their threat perception. So top threats for visitors to outdoor recreation and tourism on Mount Desert Island included the increased presence of ticks and increased presence of mosquitoes, followed by extreme weather events, heat waves, and higher temperatures. We found that similarly, tourism suppliers were also very concerned about the increased presence of ticks on the island and extreme weather events as those related to infrastructure and accessibility challenges. So we can see a couple of illustrative quotes here. The first is from Lucas, again, a pseudonym, who is a municipal official on the island. And he was describing how the increased presence of ticks and tick-borne illnesses was an unaddressed epidemic on Mount Desert Island and other communities that was really serious. And he thought it was especially serious because they have a tourism economy and people won't even know that they're being infected while visiting the area. We have a quote from George, who's talking about the intersection between extreme weather events, infrastructure, and accessibility. So George is describing how the island is very vulnerable because there's one road onto the island that also carries the phone and power supply. And that stretch of road is very low lying to sea level. So if a hurricane came and knocked out that road or knocked down a bunch of trees at a campground or otherwise damaged some of the coastal infrastructure, it could be very difficult to manage that emergency locally. So a quick comparison shows that suppliers were concerned about changes to the natural resource base, broadly speaking, and that included the increased presence of ticks, which was also a top concern for visitors. We also saw that suppliers were perceived extreme weather events and the impact to infrastructure as a top threat from climate change, including the impacts to especially low-lying coastal roads, homes located close to the shoreline, docks, and island access. And this perceived threat was mirrored by visitors who also indicated that extreme weather events, sea level rise, road damage, and power outages were top threats for them as well. So shifting the focus more to behavioral responses, we asked visitors if climate conditions were no longer appropriate for your recreational pursuits in Acadia National Park, how likely would you be to engage in the following substitution behaviors? And it's important to note that overall, our sample had a high likelihood to engage in substitution behaviors, but the top three most likely substitutions were visiting another place in the US, visiting Acadia National Park, but during another time of year, and visiting Acadia National Park, but pursuing other tourism and outdoor recreation activities. In terms of suppliers, we saw a range of adaptation and mitigation strategies being employed, especially related to adaptation behaviors. Two examples focus on managing for increased high precipitation events, which the area is seeing more frequently, as well as changing business product offerings. So we have Maddie here describing these intense precipitation events as happening more frequently. So some of the park's work around erosion, managing for that, and managing for stream connectivity is to understand hydrological change and to better engineer systems and infrastructure that can accommodate those higher, more frequent flows. Similarly, we saw that Brad, as a business owner, was talking about how the area still gets snow, but it's no longer reliable. So we can't tell visitors who might be coming in the winter to plan for having snow for their vacations. And it's actually part of his business plan that he no longer offers because of that unreliability in snowfall. So we can see from this comparison that suppliers and visitors were either likely to or already engaging in a range of behavioral responses as a result of climate change. Visitors had that high intention to engage in spatial, temporal, and activity substitution. Suppliers were employing a range of strategies, including improving infrastructure, such as replacing culverts, as well as adopting ecosystem management approaches to improve general ecological resilience. We also saw a lot of intended solar energy projects, although I would say overall that these were more aspirational in nature and had not yet been realized on the island, or at least in terms of the tourism industry. And then we can also see changing business operations, so changing the timing of product offerings and product diversification, as well as some planning led by Acadia National Park and other partners. So we did see quite a bit of overlap in the perceived threats. So both visitors and suppliers thought increased tick populations and extreme weather events were top threats to tourism on Mount Desert Island. This could indicate that adaptation strategies put in place by suppliers will likely be supported by visitors. So that could both reduce negative perceptions that visitors might have, and it might actually be the case that visitors would be willing to pay for some of those adaptation behaviors because of the alignment and threat perceptions. We did see some areas of divergence in terms of threats. So visitors were concerned about mosquitoes, higher temperatures, and heat waves, and those threat perceptions were not mirrored by suppliers. Similarly, some suppliers mentioned that they were concerned about the potential for overcrowding and more large-scale shifts to the natural resource space. And this might be an indicator of where suppliers may fail to meet visitor expectations, which again could result in negative perceptions of the destination and shifts in visitation. One thing I wanted to highlight for a possible explanation for some of the divergence in threat perceptions is this idea of warmer temperatures, which were perceived as a threat by visitors, but were actually perceived as an opportunity by tourism suppliers because they knew that visitation was expected to increase. So it might be important for suppliers to consider things like installing air conditioning or perhaps developing indoor programming that's less strenuous for those high heat days to better adapt to visitor expectation. Overall, we found that our sample of visitors had a high likelihood of substitution. So in terms of anticipating those visitor shifts, suppliers might think about changing the timing of product offerings and product diversification, as well as shifting management strategies, which we're already seeing them doing based on this study. And something that was interesting and that I would suggest warrants further study is suppliers. So we didn't ask visitors about perceptions of crowding, but it did come up in several supplier interviews. And this might end up not being a problem for visitors as they're more spatially able to adapt within a destination to avoid crowding. So for example, if I perceive crowding will negatively impact my experience on MDI, perhaps I will avoid the Park Loop Road, which contains many of the popular attractions, and I might go to the more quiet side of the island. So it could be that visitor intention to substitute could help with things like spacing out visitation over time and space and alleviate the stress related to crowding. It's also important to note that while crowding might negatively impact Mount Desert Island, it could be perceived as an opportunity for the Bay of Machias, again, as maybe visitors look further north to alleviate any problems with perceived crowding. So some limitations around the visitor survey. We were only able to sample during the summer months. And while this is when peak visitation occurs to the area, it would be important to capture other visitor segments who might already be engaging in that temporal substitution behavior. I'll also note that we measured behavioral intention in the survey. So it's possible that these substitutions could be realized, but we also know that behavioral intention does not always translate into behavioral change. And some future research directions, I would suggest looking a little bit more into this potential issue of overcrowding. So is it something that is going to motivate changes in visitation? Is it something that could increase tensions within the local community, especially between those who benefit directly from tourism and those who may perceive that they don't benefit directly from tourism? I'm also interested in understanding what kinds of mechanisms could further enable collective adaptation or mitigation strategies that would appeal to a broad range of stakeholder groups. So starting to wrap up here, in the Bay of Machias, we saw that this destination embodied many elements of the Berkey's and Ross community resilience framework, including things like social networks, people-place relationships, engaged governance, and leadership. And it's important to note that climate change resilience will look different across destinations and communities. And it's important to match actions with the capacities of each community or each destination. This study could be a way for other communities to better understand their own resilience to climate change or other shocks and stressors, especially as we tend to think about built and financial resources rather than necessarily social or community resources. And I think this work can also help us identify areas where state government or other levels of government can better support communities. So for example, a lot of the infrastructure changes that the community was looking for in the Bay of Machias was not directly within their control. So that might be an area where state policy could help enhance resilience. In terms of Mount Desert Island, we did see quite a bit of overlap between perceptions of threats. So that's an area where suppliers are likely already adapting and where visitors would likely support adaptation initiatives. We also saw areas of divergence, which might indicate areas where suppliers might want to target behaviors to continue to meet visitor expectations. So both to retain repeat visitors, but also to draw from emerging markets. And overall, it's important for destinations to anticipate visitor climate change responses to, again, better understand how to retain and attract new visitors. And in the context of the state of Maine, tourism is an important economic activity. So better understanding the interaction between supply and demand and how that can increase capacity building and adaptation to climate change will be important. Overall, this research helps us gain a more holistic understanding of how coastal tourism stakeholders perceive their risk to climate change and react based on those risk perceptions, and how that could enhance or limit destination resilience, in this case to climate change. We contribute to resilience literature in the context of tourism, as well as being able to study both supply and demand as a function of destination resilience. And then while we did focus on climate change for this study, it could be that lessons learned about destination resilience can apply to other shocks and stressors that communities and destinations might face. So with that, I have a ton of acknowledgements to make. Certainly not everyone is on this page, but I'd like to start by thanking my advisor, Dr. Sandra de Arias-Stone, for her support, as well as the support of my awesome committee members, so Bridie, Pari, Laura, and Aaron. I had a host of research assistants that were instrumental in this work, especially in executing the survey and in transcribing interviews. So I'd like to thank Nathaniel, Mackenzie, Ashley, Asha, Nick, Hope, Morales, and Alyssa. I'd also like to thank my lab group and my NRT cohort, especially the Shifting Seasons group, for their continued support throughout this process. Shout out to the writing group, who have been really instrumental in making me write my dissertation, mostly over this summer. And of course, this work could not have been done without the support of Acadia National Park to facilitate on-site visitor surveys, as well as all the research participants, including visitors and interviewees. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge that this work was supported by NOAA, by the USDA NIFA McIntyre Stennis program, and by the NSF NRT. And with that, I will take questions.
Hey, Lydia, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Nicole.
I'll go first, I guess. Great job. I loved it. It's so great to see it all coming together after so many years of hard work. So congrats on that. I really liked how you were drawing the connections of the resilience to climate change to economic shocks and the pandemic, and just making this connection between the community resilience for rural emerging destinations. So I was just wondering, you know, in light of COVID, do you think that your findings or applications or recommendations would be changed or interpreted in some different ways now? You know, if communities were to take this information with the impact now of COVID, does that really change anything, or does that just sort of represent a different shock?
So thanks for the question, Nicole. One of the interesting things that a few interview participants touched upon when I had to switch to the phone interviews because of COVID-19 was actually using COVID-19 as something that might, using COVID-19 as an impact that might exemplify what could happen for climate change disruption. So they were like explicitly making the connection between, yeah, there's no visitors coming because everyone is staying home. And one of the things from the literature is that destinations are vulnerable to climate change because of a lack of access. And in this case, it didn't necessarily, in the case of COVID-19, that didn't mean that you could physically not get to these destinations, but that it was not safe to do so. And so in the context of climate change, we might see something like it is more difficult to physically get to these destinations, which could influence visitor flows. So I was kind of happy that stakeholders were explicitly making that connection.
Awesome. I guess just a broad kind of follow-up question for the whole project. Was there an element of maybe your data collection or analysis that was challenging, that if you were to redo it, would you approach it maybe in a different way or make some modifications?
Yeah, so for those of you who know me, stats is like not, I would not consider it to be a forte. I think my brain works much more qualitatively, and I'm more comfortable with those data collection and analysis processes. So actually, the visitor survey, one thing I didn't really present on was a statistical analysis, a regression analysis, to better understand what psychological and social factors influenced visitor risk perceptions. And it was one of those things where I designed the survey thinking I knew what I was doing. And then I took a stats class after the survey had been implemented. And I was like, oh, now I really see how some of those decisions related to survey construction impacted analysis. So there are a few minor things I might tweak related to the survey. And, you know, if we had known that COVID-19 was happening, maybe I would have tried to finish the interviews before that disruption. But who would have predicted? Not me. So yeah, some minor tweaks that I might have changed if I had more knowledge of the analysis process and knew about COVID-19.
I believe Amber has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Great presentation, Lydia. I have a two-part question. For your MDI study, your list of perceived threats, did you give survey takers a list of threats, or was that list of threats generated by their responses?
That's a great question. So the list of threats was supplied by us, and that was based on some previous surveys in the area that did include some more open-ended responses.
Okay, great. My second question kind of follows up to that. So I'm wondering, did anybody bring up the concerns about fire risk, given that back in 1947, a big part of the island burned?
Yeah, so it definitely wasn't highlighted a lot by suppliers, but there were, I think, maybe one or two participants who had sort of described more so they had said, yes, okay, we're expecting increases in fire in the West, but we're also potentially expecting, not on the same scale, but fires here in Maine as well. So it's like a little bit of the sample, but it didn't rise. Maybe if we had done interviews after the situation right now in the West, that would have been maybe more on their minds.
Yeah, or if you were over the age of 80 or so, maybe that would have been more on their minds as well. But
Yeah.
it's a while since that fire happened. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks. Oh, Sandra, I think you're muted.
I thought that I had clicked on mute. Thank you to everyone who has participated. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have other questions for Lydia after the defense. And again, thank you for attending. We're gonna have about 5 minutes to give Lydia a break, and then we're gonna move on to the closed session. But thank you for everyone for joining, and thank you, Lydia.
Yes, thank you all for your support.